musicians, inviting the Spirit in with us today. The miracle of the loaves and the fishes. It starts out with, now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew in a boat to a deserted place by himself. So what was it that he heard? Well, the thing Jesus had just heard about was John the Baptist's murder by King Herod at a feast. Now John and Jesus were cousins, and it was John who baptized Jesus, which marked the beginning of Jesus' ministry. So he was close to John, and he was mourning the loss of his cousin, his friend. The feeding of the multitudes, loaves and fish, is a miracle. It is a miracle that is recorded in all four of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we tend to focus on the miracle of Jesus multiplying a small amount of food so that all could be fed. And that's great, but I think we can miss something else about this story if we just focus on the miracle of the abundance of the food. Now Matthew tells us in the first chapter of his book that Jesus is Emmanuel, which means God with us. And for the one who made the world out of nothing and created light from darkness, multiplying some food and loaves and fish was really no big deal. However, in the first century, Jesus wasn't the only one that people claimed was working wonders. Nor was he the only one that people hailed as the Messiah. He wasn't even the only one who claimed to be the Son of God. Most of the Caesars did that. Neither Jesus nor his early followers imagined that stories about wondrous acts would convince people of the divine origin of Jesus. Rather, the wonders that Jesus performed were, as John, who wrote the Gospel of John, tells us, are always signs of the character of the God whose presence Jesus bears. So what John said in his Gospel is that Jesus came and his miracles that he performed were actually signs to show us the character of God. The point isn't what Jesus does today, but why he does it. Because in the character of the God that Jesus reveals and represents is captured in a single word, which I think we're very low on in our world today, and that word is compassion. Matthew says that when Jesus saw the great crowd that had followed him, he had compassion on them. Here he was grieving his own loss of John. He had wanted to get away in a boat by himself for a while to pray, to be alone, to talk to God. And the crowds followed him. And he put aside his own grief, his own hurting, and ministered to those who came seeking him. So he healed those who were sick, he tended to their needs, and shared with them his presence. Now evening rolls around and they find themselves without food. So he feeds them. Now, in the first century, gods aren't normally supposed to care about people like the mass crowds that followed Jesus. The gods of the ancient philosophers were considered dispassionate, removed from the sufferings or the needs of humanity. Gods were referred to by names like the unmoved mover or first cause. At the other end of the spectrum, the gods of the Greek and the Roman empires were notorious for using human beings as playthings and for ordering the world to their whims. Anybody remember we had to study mythology in high school? Anybody remember that? At best, gods were supposed to take the side of the rich and powerful, to stand with people like Herod and his well-fed party guest, sanctioning their exploitation of the poor and even the bloody murder of the truth-teller like John the Baptist. The gods of the Greeks and the Romans were definitely not known for siding with those who were oppressed, the ordinary people, the downtrodden, or even those who were hungry. And yet, it's okay. They're turning the air conditioners down so we can cool off a little. And yet, when Jesus feeds the multitude, he renews, embodies, and fulfills a consistent call of the God of Israel to feed the hungry. You see that time and time again throughout the Bible. Make no mistake, this was no minor endeavor, as what we now call food scarcity wasn't only known in the ancient world, it was rampant. Now the disciples, when they realized that people didn't have food, suggested that hordes of people go buy food isn't just unrealistic. They are, after all, out in a deserted place. There's no McDonald's, no Wendy's, no grocery store. It's a bit ridiculous and even a little insulting, as the folks making up this desperate crowd probably didn't even have money to buy food if there was food vendors there. And so Jesus tells his disciples to get over their callous self-concern and feed them themselves. Now, one way to look at this brief exchange is to say that the disciples were thinking out of a theology of scarcity. We don't have enough to go around. We can't feed all of these people with what little provisions we have. Somewhat similar to so many comments that we hear so frequently today, that America, which is the richest country in the world, is so poor that we cannot afford to care for the poorest people among us. We are told that we should quit all of these social programs for poor people, because after all, it's their fault they're poor. Because we can just no longer afford them, and it's really not our problem. We've had so many tax cuts and so many wars that we are deeply in debt. We just don't have the federal resources any longer to keep so many people on food stamps or WIC or school lunch programs or even the earned income tax credit. Just like the disciples said, we can't feed those people because as a community, we just don't have the resources to do it. Now, churches sadly tend to do this when looking at ministries. We just don't have the money. It costs too much. We're a poor congregation. Too often we make decisions based on theology of scarcity. Now, Jesus, on the other hand, had a theology of abundance. That is, that share what you've got, because ultimately God provides everything anyway. When you hold on to stuff, when you hoarding stuff, not good. Which brings us to the second miracle of the story. Jesus uses his disciples, even when they would rather look after themselves, to tend to the needs of those thousands of men, women, and children. Using words and actions which are kind of foreshadowing the Last Supper, Matthew depicts what happens when you move from a view of scarcity, we have nothing here but 5 loaves and fishes, to one of abundance. Thank you, God, for these 5 loaves and fishes. If we could shift our thinking, thank you, God, for what I do have, instead of thinking of not what I don't have, our whole perception would change. What we believe becomes our reality, I think. The disciples are caught up in Jesus' words of abundance and gratitude. And so they get over themselves and they distribute what they have and participate in all the wonder and joy because the mass crowd ate and were filled. God used those reluctant disciples to care for the poor and hungry that God loves so much. And I believe that miracle continues today.
Amen.
When someone who's a college graduate passes a high-paying job in order to go teach disadvantaged kids, that's one of God's miracles. When one student stands up against bullies in defense of another student, the God of compassion is again miraculously revealed. When a small community of faith makes a promise that no one who comes to our doors will be turned away hungry, God is still at work performing miracles through disciples that are eager, sometimes reluctant, and everything in between. Miracles that easily rival those reported in today's reading of the loaves and fishes. The miracles continue when in our own trials and struggles, someone seeking help finds us and we can show them a different way and share our journey and be an example of God's love and compassion. The real wonder of this story of the loaves and fishes is a reminder that God still cares deeply and passionately for those who are the most vulnerable, the poor, those who are immigrants, the hungry, and God continues to use us to care for them. So this week I'm going to challenge you to notice when God is working through you and others to care for those who are vulnerable. As you receive your communion today, remember once again that you have been fed by God's heavenly food to go and do likewise, sharing God's love with all you meet and especially with those in the deepest of needs. There are 2 miracles in our story which have little to do with just simply multiplying loaves and fishes. Our God is a compassionate God, not far away and removed from us. And as God's followers, as we look to Jesus, we are the disciples, sometimes reluctant, sometimes scared, sometimes unsure. But God has called us to do God's work, so God can work through us. And when God calls, God always equips. When we look at this story, we can ask ourselves, which is the greatest miracle? For Jesus to radically change those few loaves into abundance of loaves? Or for Jesus to change the hearts of the people who were there, to teach them how to share and how to serve? So what's the greater miracle for us today? For Jesus to do all of the work for us, and we not do anything? Or for Jesus to change us and to enable us to do it? Will you join me in prayer, please? We thank you, God, for showing us and teaching us that you are a God of compassion and that you care for each one of us and you care for the least of these and that we can make a difference. Too often we look at the world and say, I can't do anything about it. We might not be able to radically change the entire world, but we can radically change a small part of it. It's in our neighborhood, our workplace, our homes, our church. We can do what you call us to do, and let us do it boldly and without fear. And in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. God bless you.